Welcome, and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. As many of us approach 50 and beyond, we find that the older we get, the more things we end up leaving behind. Loss is certainly inevitable for all of us. Joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program today is a wonderful person who's going to be sharing with us how we deal with loss, especially being in the now. I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today our guest, Violet Young. Violet, thank you for joining us today.
Oh, Daniel, it is such a pleasure to talk with you. I have been looking forward to this.
Now, how did all this start for you, your interest in healing, and especially when it comes to something like loss?
Well, gee, that's an interesting question. I've been, my very first experience of death was when I was about 3. And my uncle passed away. And I've been going to funerals ever since I was a 3-year-old.
Mm-hmm.
And back in the 50s, my mother believed that life and death were very, very connected and that I should be exposed so that I understood these things. And so I wasn't frightened by it because it was explained to me. And my uncle, who had passed away, was very, very old. He was in his 90s.
Mm-hmm.
And I remembered him, and I remember him to this day as a charming gentleman. And so I was at the funeral, and I looked around and saw how people were feeling horrible. And I realized that people had to figure out a way to deal with this. Now, I was very young, but my relatives were all pretty old. So from the time I was 3, I was exposed to a lot of people leaving. They were older folks. And you start to watch the ups and downs. And I had kind of a rocky childhood because of illnesses in my family. So I was always exposed to things changing, and not always for what one would think the better. So I've learned how to become extremely resilient, and I've learned to look at the gifts that I get and the gifts that I can give to others during these times of stress. And that has really helped shape who I've become.
Mm-hmm. Now, how do you find, do people generally deal with loss in the same way, or is it really varied from person to person?
It varies quite a bit. I mean, if you spend any time looking at the sympathy cards at a store, it's pretty interesting. So many of them, they look really pretty. I pick up a card to send, and I look inside, and it says absolutely nothing. And I think to myself, that is how a lot of people deal with death. They look at something, they don't know what to do with it because they haven't been prepared that life and death and love and loss are so interconnected. And when you read those things, our thoughts are with you during this sad time, or we they're very cut and dried. There's not a lot of humanity in there addressing those feelings. So I always end up by writing personal notes if I'm sending a sympathy card.
Why do you think that is, that they seem so cut and dry? It's almost as though we want to tiptoe across this rather than just dive in.
Well, most people are afraid of it.
Mm-hmm.
I realize that I might have a somewhat unique idea here for myself, but I watch people just sort of gloss over it. They're afraid to really get in and grieve. And if you don't grieve and you don't deal with these things, they bite you later. And I got a lesson like that when my 2 young, very young, like 17 days old and 2 years old, died in a house fire.
Uh-huh.
When my daughter was a little baby, when she was little, and the older boy was my daughter's best friend. And I helped the mother, my sister-in-law, deal with the loss, and it was unthinkable, the loss. And I was so busy helping her. I mean, a house fire is a mess, to clean up, and then you have the issue with the children dying and trying to tell that to my daughter was one of the hardest things I've ever done. It ranks, there's probably 2 or 3 things in my life that were just hideously difficult to do, and that was one of them. And I was very busy helping her, and I just was so busy trying to soothe my daughter and soothe my sister-in-law and deal with these things that I basically didn't take the time to grieve the loss myself. And life got more difficult for us, and I moved out to the West Coast, and I just glossed over everything. And unfortunately, many years later, like 15 years later, there was a little girl who was kidnapped and subsequently killed in California named Polly Klaas. It was a huge, huge thing, and it was not very far from where we lived. And I tried to not pay much attention to that either, but I happened to be watching the TV when they found her body, and they showed the body bag being loaded into the coroner's car. And unfortunately, it flashed me back to seeing my nephew's body in a body bag, because that happened to be watching the TV when that particular scene came from the house fire. And those 2 things coalesced, and I was plunged into the depths of despair for about 3 months. I was in a deep, dark hole because I hadn't grieved, and I had piles of grief over me. I thought I was in the darkest place I've ever been in my life. And that was 15 years after that thing had happened. So I pulled myself out of that with the help of many, many friends who came out of the woodwork to support me. People were calling me that didn't even know I was not doing well. I was hearing from people. I mean, it was like the angels sent the whole flotilla of friends to deal with me. And I was able to pull out of that and make my life better. But it taught me an extraordinarily valuable lesson, that it is really important to grieve in the moment that it's happening. And to be conscious of the fact that while these things are happening, you are receiving gifts and you can have support. And it's really, really, really important to feel your feelings, because if we stuff them, don't worry, they're still there. We just don't notice them. And then they come up, and then you wish you had done it the different way.
Why do you think people tend to want to gloss over or not express their feeling of grief?
Most of the time people are not, our culture is not terribly well versed in expressing our feelings anyway. It's a cultural thing, I think, in some ways, and some families don't really deal with grief. They think it's a bad thing. They think that you shouldn't feel this way, and then people have an attitude about how you're supposed to feel. So who feels comfortable with it? I mean, personally, I think that grief is a very solitary thing in some parts. In other parts of it, it is a community thing. And our culture is, I think, starting to learn that, because we have taken in some information from other places. But as a general rule, on a personal level, I mean, I'm not sure that people are taught very well how to grieve. I'm reminded of a very funny routine that I once saw on TV. I'd love to get my hands on a copy of it. It was a TV show that had Carol Burnett, it had Robin Williams, it had Carl Reiner, and it had Whoopi Goldberg. And it was a one-time thing. It was just hysterical. They did these little sketches. And you put all of those people together on a stage. Oh, my God. The talent was amazing. And there were several very funny yet poignant sketches that they did. And one of them was Carol Burnett played a grieving wife, and Robin Williams played, and her husband had been a bus driver. And Robin Williams played one of the bus driver's passengers who comes to the funeral. And Carol Burnett plays a very uptight woman, and she's very, very uptight and very contained. And here comes Robin Williams into the funeral hall, and he approaches the widow, and he talks to her, and he tells her that she needs to keen. And the two of them end up with her howling and screaming, and it was just a remarkable sketch. And one of the things that happened was they did it one way, the way it was written, and then Robin Williams, this was a live show, Robin Williams asked Carol Burnett, right on camera, can I do this again? And so he had her howling at the moon practically. Mm-hmm. But it was a demonstration of really getting into how the feeling in your body needs to be emoted through your body. And for that reason, it was it was funny to watch, but it was really, really important information. And we're so self-contained, we cry, but we don't cry very much. Or, if somebody does emote, then they're looked at as if they're nuts. Personally, I remember when my dad had passed away and I was staying in my parents' house. My mother was in a nursing home at the time. She had just been admitted to the nursing home, and the day that she got her nursing home bed was the day my dad was diagnosed with a liver tumor. And a week later, he passed away. And so I was left at home to deal with the house and go over everything at the home. And I was there for days. I was visiting from the West Coast, so I was staying in New Hampshire. I was there for like 4 or 5 months. And I remember walking from room to room in my parents' house and just howling and screaming and crying. There was nobody there except for the 2 cats who walked around behind me crying. And everything in their life had changed, and I was emoting that feeling of complete helplessness, hopelessness, loss. Mm-hmm. And I was better for it, trust me, because my mother was in quite a state, and unfortunately, she could not cry. She was just so upset. So I processed things that were hers through myself. But when I was done, I felt like I was done. I didn't carry that with me. So I think keening is a really appropriate thing to do, where you just feel that pain and utter those words and statements and those sounds, and you let it go through your whole body. Mm-hmm. And then you're not holding everything back, where you find out later you can blow up. It's just...
Yeah, I was going to see how do you think it will express itself if you don't release and experience grief?
Well, I know that what happens is that people can become extraordinarily depressed, mm-hmm. or they can become extremely outraged. Whatever it is, it's usually not a positive if they have not dealt with these feelings, because it eats away at you. Mm-hmm. And for people who don't express their grief, first off, you have to deal with people, well, she didn't cry. Well, that's not for you to say how she's going to express her grief, but so there's a lot of negative attention. On the other hand, if she cried, well, she was crying so much. It was like you can't please the audience. You only can please yourself. And so depending on how willing you are to get right down in there in the trench and mm-hmm. wallow for a while, wallowing is good. You just don't want to wallow for months.
Right.
But if you don't address it, you end up by suffering, and your whole, now they call it a celebration of life. A lot of times you'll have a memorial service, it's a celebration of life. And I think that's a really important way to view things. It's not everybody has to show up and be solemn. It's like, it's okay to appreciate the person. It's okay to enjoy the jokes and the mannerisms of that individual. It's okay to share all the wonderful things you know about them and to really celebrate their life. I think that's a much better way of doing it. But there's always going to be a place in there where someone's pissed off that the person left them. Mm-hmm. These are parts of the whole shebang.
Gotcha.
Nothing is cut and dried here, and that's one of the problems with our culture is that people like it all tidy.
Right,
and lots
exactly.
of grief. You know what? It's not tidy.
Well, it's interesting, too, because when you think about the person who has had the loss, it could be a husband, spouse, whatever it is, and, friends and family, they tend to act like they don't know what they're supposed to do.
That's because they don't know what they're supposed to do. Because, part of it, I think, is the mobile culture that has grown up in the last, 50 years.
Mm-hmm.
When I was a little girl, I'm 63, so when I was a little girl on the East Coast, I grew up in a Jewish family, and everybody would sit Shiva. And that basically means the family, the immediate family, is sitting in the house or wherever, and they're sitting on wooden, this is what it was like when I was a kid. They would sit on wooden boxes. All the mirrors in the house would be covered. The rest of the family, who was, the not immediate family, would come in with food and provide the grieving family with all of their needs. And that would go on for 7 days, where the family who was the immediate family could really wallow. They could really be in their grief. And at the end of the 7 days, the wife or the husband would be taken for a walk by the rabbi out into the world. They didn't leave the house during this time. They would be taken for a walk in the world. And when I was a kid, the way it was explained to me was after that, the widow would be able to go and socialize and do whatever, and everything was done. Now, I understand now that that really wasn't as cut and dried as that sounds. Mm-hmm. And I was kind of surprised by it, because as a kid, I wasn't done in 7 days. But there was a form, there was a method, there was a something. The Irish friends we had, they'd have a wake, and people would go and view the body, and they'd all, have food, and they'd all hoist a drink to whoever, and there was a connection. And a lot of times, because people have moved away, or they just didn't have this as a connection, and families are becoming as fractured as they are, those kinds of structure for grieving have sort of evaporated. And so it's sort of a pick one from column A, pick one from column B, and people are so uncomfortable. They think they're going to go on forever, and they're not.
There's a wonderful foreign film that's out there. It's Japanese. It's called Departures.
Departures?
Yeah, Departures. And it's a fascinating and beautiful film. It's about a man who's kind of down on his luck, unemployed, and he responds to a job, and he goes to this place. It's a funeral place. And what it is apparently, according to this film, there's a Japanese custom where they actually have the dead person out and exposed, and the family comes, and they sit there as the person, as he ritualistically prepares her to, go into the coffin, but this is also a time for the family to connect and grieve and whatever they do, and you see, each family or members that were connected to this dead person, express things differently, and it's just such a wonderful film, and how it's sort of like a rite of passage into the other world, if you will. And, and looking at something like that, you realize that something like grief, or however it would be for you, it's so important to have that expressed, because as you said, it could really manifest in ways that aren't so healthy.
Well, it's like people who don't express their grief, it's not like they're not feeling it.
Right.
Just because you don't tell me doesn't mean that there's not something wrong, And so they go through the next few months or years, and that is tinging everything they do. And sometimes people bury it so deeply they don't even have a clue what's bothering them. When in fact, it is basically that feeling of loss. It's like I have the event coming up on actually this weekend, and I wrote the article for the program called Love, Loss, and the Now. And I was prompted to write that because our family has just gone through the loss of our 18-year relationship with our kitty friend. Now, that little cat was as much a part of my family as any human is, I mean, he was with us 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for 18 years.
Wow.
And he was a cat who was really not a cat. He was a special spiritual entity in the body of a cat. And I could think about him, and he'd show up on my lap. I mean, I just even have to open my mouth. He would just show up. And I knew he was going to expire eventually because he had chronic kidney failure. And so we were doing subcutaneous fluids and had him on a special diet, and we were treating him with kid gloves. And he stayed with us until we were, till his body just couldn't handle it anymore. And he let us know these things. But during the time I was taking care of him, I was grieving, and I was talking with him about how much we appreciated him and how much we loved him. And there wasn't a minute that we weren't, with him, that we didn't talk to him. And we always talked to him, but we were making sure that we knew that he knew, and he was loving and sweet and delightful. He was like a cat dog. He would greet everybody who would come in the house. And his whole persona was just that way right up until the end. And for me, I grieved while I was living with him, and then I spent time afterwards taking time. So for the month of June, he died the day before my birthday. And in a way, he gave me the gift of peace of mind because I had been constantly on watch for months because of his illness. So I spent a lot of time really focusing on the love and devotion that he showed and paying attention to how he was with us. And it has definitely helped. I mean, we're all touched by this. We all miss him greatly. And this is the first time in I have not been petless for 52 years. So I feel like there's a major something missing, yet I feel his energy around me. Mm-hmm. Now, another issue for people is whether or not you have a strong belief in the afterlife. I do. I feel a connection because I do believe that we just shed the skin and our energy goes on, and that our family and our friends and our pets stick around with us. And so, for folks who don't have that as a belief system, it's probably more difficult.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it certainly is a one-way passage that you do alone, but, it seems that there's a lot of fantastic evidence proving that, there is an afterlife, and the question is how is that expressed? You were mentioning that there is I guess it's a festival, is it, that's coming up this weekend?
Right, it's our 17th annual Pathways to Transformation Holistic Health, Psychic, and Crafts Fair. That's a mouthful, huh?
But a lot of experiences.
Oh, yeah.
And how can people find out more about that if they're living in the state of Oregon?
They can go to my website, which is chucklingcherubs.com, and there's an actual program on the website. And they can also, we actually have a Facebook page now. Yes, our daughter, who's the techno person in the family, made us a Facebook page under Pathways to Transformation, Holistic Health, Psychic, and Crafts Fair. Some of the exhibitors at that event are mediums who do. There's a TV show called Medium, based on the life of a lady named Alison Dubois. And it's interesting. I picked up a copy of her book called We Are Their Heaven, and it talks about how our deceased relatives and friends hang around us, not because they're bound to us, but because we are their joy. Mm-hmm. And she talks about the connections that the deceased can make with us in our life. And so electricity is one of those things. So if the lights flicker or your phone rings and there's nobody on it, it could very well be one of your deceased friends or family connecting with you. Of course, you have to be aware of these things to make that connection. But I've had some very interesting experiences with different people in my life that I know were them. Mm-hmm. and I feel very certain that life goes on. It's just a different life beyond the veil.
Which would make a wonderful next segment when that time comes. So much to talk about with this. Go ahead and give out your website again, Violet.
Oh, thank you. It's chucklingcherubs.com. And it's we have a lot of different events going on with that. We have 22 seminars, 75 exhibitors, health and wellness products, readers, healers, people doing all kinds of stuff, body work, and a variety of goods that different kinds of lotions and potions and rocks and gems and minerals and jewelry and all kinds of stuff. It's quite a three-ring circus.
So enjoy discovering the proof of the afterlife while enjoying the life that you're in.
You know, can I write that down?
Sure.
Can
Violet,
you
thank you so much for joining us here on the program today.
Daniel, you're always a joy. Thank you so much for inviting me.
You bet. Take care.
Bye-bye.
We want to encourage you, the listeners out there, visit us at our website where we'll have more of that information for you as well. That's beyond50radio.com, the number 50. We do have a weekly news update you can sign up for there as well. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you again for joining us. This is the Beyond 50 radio program, and remember, live your day past halfway.